Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this session on decolonising assessment. I'm Becky, I'm the Chief Exec of the English Association, and I'm so pleased to be here to kick us off today, and then I will fade gracefully into the background and enjoy the conversation for our session on decolonising assessment. The EA is hosting this session for the Decolonising the Discipline network, which is a group which brings together the English Association, the Institute of English Studies, the University of East Anglia, the Postcolonial Studies Association, and University English. If you check out the Decolonising the Discipline website, you can see what we've been up to. There's recordings of all our past events on that website and some really cool things for you to explore as well. I'll pop that link in the chat, but for now, I will pass over to Vedrana, who is going to chair our conversation this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that lovely introduction, and welcome everyone. Really lovely to see so many people joining us on a rainy Friday afternoon, well, at least it's here like that in Brighton. We are very excited to welcome you to our first ever event this term, and this roundtable brings together educators from higher education and secondary education to explore different approaches to decolonising the assessment. My name is Vedrana Veličković. I'm a principal lecturer in literature at the University of Brighton. And here next to me, I'm joined by my colleague Vaja Rajapillai, also from the University of Brighton. And I'm really excited to be chairing this session with our wonderful panelists. So all of us will spend some time reflecting on what we mean by decolonising the assessment, and just going through some of the provocations and questions that we set ourselves for this panel. And we are probably going to talk about an hour and 10-15 minutes. We'll see how we get on, and then at the end there will be a chance to ask any questions. So I will now like to introduce my panelists, and I would like to start with Arunima, please.
Hello, my name is Dr. Arunima Bhattacharya. I'm a lecturer in English at the School of Arts and Creative Industries at the Edinburgh Napier University. And I've very recently joined the Decolonising the Discipline network as well. I work broadly on postcolonial literature's migration and decolonisation, and have been very recently working on a cultural heritage project, the third project in this line, with cultural heritage institutions, mostly museums in Glasgow and Scotland. So that's me. Thank you.
Thank you. And up next, we have Bethan Marshall.
Hi, I'm Dr. Bethan Marshall. I work in education at King's College London, and I'm basically focused on secondary education rather than higher education. And in secondary education, decolonising is trickier to do, especially in English, because they are focused on, the greats, or so they say, like the Victorian literature and stuff. And so that's basically my field. I've got a PhD student who is doing stuff on decolonising the curriculum, which is a really exciting thing, and she's done an awful lot. And I think she's on this thing, so I'm hoping that she may ask a pertinent question. But I've also done other things. So I've been part of the parliamentary group on the Empire, and I've done stuff on Africa as well for the parliamentary groups too.
Great, thank you, Bethan. And it looks like your student is here. Just said hello in the chat.
She's here, yeah. She's saying hello. Well, hello, Catherine.
Brilliant. And then we have Fozia.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. My name is Fozia Bora. I'm a professor of Islamic history at the University of Leeds. My interest in decolonising goes back a long way, but the more recent developments that I've been really privileged to be part of is where we had the level 3 or third year module on decolonising approaches, and that's now led into students working in the community, and where they devise their own outputs and where they actually take charge of their own assessment journey in many ways. So I'm happy to speak to that when the time comes. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That sounds very exciting. And then we have Kaya.
Hi everybody, my name is Kaya. My pronouns are she, her. I'm an anti-racist / racial justice advocate, and I've been doing that for almost 7 years now. And I've transformed my digital advocacy into community action work on the grassroots level, but informed from my youth work background and my education background as a teacher. I've transformed that also into Youth the Gap, which is an educational consultancy that's on a mission to reimagine education for it to be truly equitable in terms of access, representation, and overall experience in education as well. I'm very delighted to be working alongside Brighton University and also local schools within the area. And we have a national reach, which I'm very grateful to say, working from infants up until higher education.
Amazing. Thank you, Kaya. And then Steph.
Hi, I'm Steph Keenan and I'm Head of Product for English at AQA, and that means that I'm responsible for the English qualifications, GCSEs, A-levels and so on, and also the support that is around those qualifications. And prior to that, I was a teacher for many years, and prior to that, I worked in television. So, you know, my teaching experience as well as my role in ARC, Multi Academy Trust, and within AQA now has made me very aware of the kind of structures, parameters, pressures and so on that teachers and leaders in English have to work with, around, within, and they're the structures that we're all working with at the moment. So I'm very interested to be here with a very distinguished panel and here to learn as much as to have comments.
Amazing, thank you, Steph. And finally, Vi.
Hi, I'm Vi Rajapillai, Principal Lecturer, English Language and Politics and Media. Vedran and I have been working on the Decolonising curriculum at University of Brighton and working with Kaya to a community project on anti-racism education. My background comes from world Englishes and how language and the post-colonial countries interact with it and think about ways in which we can decolonize.
Brilliant. And I do realize that I didn't say anything about what I do, apart from being at the University of Brighton. So my specialism is in contemporary literature, and specifically in Black British writing and post-communist Eastern European writing. And with Vi, I've been running the kind of the student-led grassroots Decol collective for a number of years, where we supported the students to come up with their own projects. And yeah, I think that's lead us nicely into the first question of this panel, which is around what we mean by decolonizing assessment. And I suppose when we were preparing for this panel, we know that there's so many publications in the area of decolonizing the curriculum. And even now in most subject areas, there are resources or publications or student-led initiatives at various universities across the country and beyond around the curriculum, and also around some areas of pedagogy and teaching, but there isn't that much around decolonizing the assessment, which is quite interesting. I think apart from a couple of articles, we couldn't really find many resources available. So I'd like us to start by really reflecting on this question of what we mean by decolonizing the assessment. And feel free to unmute yourself if you have any instant reflections on this question.
I can go first, just to start the discussion off. For me, it has always been so what are we assessing? What are we assessing generally? And with assessment, there's a big idea of power relationship happening. I mean, in teaching generally, but assessment actually ultimately lives on that idea of power and who gets to assess. And then the question is, what are we assessing? What exactly are we looking from the students that are doing the assessment? And this is where, for me, it starts to kind of challenge some of the ideas of this very top-down and knowledge that's constructed in a particular way and expect a particular outcome. And so, yeah, I'm hoping somebody else is going to kind of
I can see Kaya has her hand up, so feel free to come in.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting because I was doing my research behind this topic as well, and the closest I could really find to this is decolonizing evaluation. And when we think about evaluation, it's all about what it upholds. And when we think about what we evaluate, who is pointed at, and often what we find with assessment is that it's pointing fingers at the students, as if they are the product of their own failures versus what it is upholding, which is often the system which is outdated and only constitutes to essentially benefits those who fit the norm. So when we think about decolonizing assessment, I see it also through the lens of decolonizing evaluation and thinking about how we evaluate, what knowledge does that come from? Is it rooted in colonial history? And we think about the colonial history, how do we decolonize that? And who do we involve with that? Because we can't essentially decolonize without including the most marginalized in society. And that has to be radically included in the center. So yeah, I think that's kind of like my take on it as well.
Thank you. I suppose you kind of both raised the kind of the power relations and the colonial residues in assessment. But I've got Arunima and then Bethan up next to contribute to this question.
Thank you. Whatever you both said, kind of got me started at thinking. I had jotted some points, and I was also looking into reading up something for this, and I looked up the resources that you had lined up for the blurb itself, and it kind of took me back to this book, Bell Hooks' Teaching to Transgress, and I was hoping to, if we were to make slides and stuff, to get something from this book up there. But I was also thinking we have been kind of thinking in classrooms, particularly in terms of how to teach, trying to share the power with the students in a way that they can address how they are meeting the learning outcomes and the criteria, and kind of making the process of designing the assessment itself as a collaborative thing. I know that there are pressures of time, like practical considerations during classroom time and contact time and teaching time that's taken away from this sometimes, because not every module can run it in the same way. But I have found that extremely, when I was reading the resources that were tagged to the blurb, they were looking at the same things. And I found, okay, this is then the right way to sort of verbalize it and put it in words in terms of thinking about it collaboratively, contextualizing it, because we are adding a self-reflective element to even the essay form. And we can discuss more about that, but mostly. And of course, keeping the assessment itself as an improvisatory, like being okay with the word improvisatory when it comes to assessments, because that is the nature of learning, I guess, because it is changing with every class and every cohort that we are interacting with. So those are my preliminary thoughts, and I'll get back to them as I hear you guys.
Thank you so much. And as you were speaking, I remember I kind of keep going back to, the rigidity of assessment and how we write it. I can think of the forms when we write a module descriptor and then the learning outcomes, and how they by themselves don't allow, as you say, any flexibility. But yeah, we'll come back to that. Bethan, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in schools, the assessment system is hugely problematic, particularly in English, because it's all examination based. So it's 100% examination, and they've just brought out the new reform things, the review, and that has maintained the status quo, really. So it's still going to be 100% examination, and that is a very hierarchical way of doing it, and it's a very top-down way of doing it. And actually, it is colonial in its, in the way in which it's imagined. I mean, it's completely colonial, and also it's canonical, which is very colonial in its output. So I think that in schools there is a real struggle actually with the whole summative assessment system as we face it. I mean, there are ways around it, and you can try and encourage the student voice more when you're looking at literature. My student had a very good session on Jekyll and Hyde, and she had a very good way of doing Jekyll and Hyde that kind of took apart the notion of the Victorian gentleman, which was a colonial image. So there are ways around it, but nevertheless, it is a very, very hierarchical system. The way I would like to push forward is through formative assessment and assessment for learning, which very much celebrates the student voice and student learning and student autonomy, which is really, really important in schools. In schools, if you are, of an ethnic minority, there you have no voice. So again, the new curriculum has tried to introduce diversity, and they've said, we want to diversify the texts, but they have retained the way the syllabus sits for GCSE. So in literature, the syllabus still is Shakespeare and Victorian books and British writers post 1900, and that restricts it hugely from teachers wanting to diversify more, and even diversification is not the same as decolonising either. So you can say, well, looking at more diverse literature, but that's not the same as decolonising. So it's a very problematic area in English in schools.
Thank you so much. And obviously it's even more difficult within the confines of the national curriculum. And we did have a quick discussion about this in our preparatory session. So maybe we can come back to that, especially the government's recent changes to the curriculum. But I'd like to bring in Fozia and then Steph.
Thank you. I really appreciate my colleagues kind of setting the scene and bringing up their experiences. I found it quite challenging personally to balance empowering students with an understanding that they do have a voice, particularly at university, in a way that's not so possible at school, that they do have a voice in terms of how we shape modules, how we shape learning outcomes. And it is a kind of a dialogue, and we're encouraged to involve our students in quite meaningful ways. But the challenge arises when you end up saying to the students that this is a colonial university, our knowledge system is colonial, it's a hierarchy, and not have them feel undermined in their own learning journey. Because for them, they still have to engage, and for many students who are minoritized, whether on the basis of gender, sexuality, or particularly ethnicity, and even religion and belief and disability, this can often be a route to upward mobility. So for them to achieve well is really important. So it's to getting that balance right between saying to them, things are open, we can have conversations about what works well as an assessment or an evaluation of your learning, and even the learning system itself, the whole knowledge system is up for discussion, but then not pushing them into a feeling that they aren't doing something meaningful by being at university. So I find that quite a tricky area. And the way I try to explain to them, I'd love to hear from colleagues about how they manage this kind of dynamic. What I say to them is you're always in a negotiation with institutions. You're never really kind of able to fully embrace what it does, but also not fully rejecting what it does, because it's a space, and it can be a radical space. It can be a space for change, as long as you're part of the process. So yeah, I don't know what other people do, but for me, finding that balance between empowering students but not undermining the learning process has been something I've had to grapple with. Thank you.
That is so interesting. I mean, we can come and talk about this. As you say, it's a balancing act, but also important to have those conversations with the students. So thank you so much for bringing all this up. Steph, what are your thoughts on decolonizing assessment?
Yeah, I really like that phrase that Fozia used there, or we will always be in negotiation with institutions. And, having been on my own journey from sort of student to now head of product at AQA and all the ups and downs in between, I studied at Sussex in the 90s, which was quite a radical hotbed at the time, and thoroughly enjoyed it. But it's that negotiation with institutions, isn't it? That if we're working in education, that we're always going to have to wrestle with. And I agree with Bethan's point there about, diversifying is different to decolonizing. And I think if you'd have asked me when I was a student in the 90s, I would have been absolutely the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, and revolution, tear it all down. But I think, Fozia's point there, it's very true, isn't it? Our students have worked really hard to have opportunities in their life that will give them choices and options, and they have to navigate the system that they're in. So it's about that simultaneous empowerment of the students by giving them qualifications, routes, those passports, if you like, to making choices in their lives that are the current, that is the current system, while also thinking, okay, as a teacher, as a leader of English, how can I, create what bell hooks might describe as, active participants in my classroom? How can I create a space within my classroom or my school or my community of schools or multi-academy trust, a space where, everyone contributes, everyone is heard, everyone has their own, can influence the dynamic. And I think one of the things that we perhaps need to champion more within this is, the role of speaking and listening in the English classroom, of dialogic teaching, of things like, I used to work with Let's Think English, which was very sort of subject specific oracy approaches, rather than this sort of generic oracy frameworks, which can also be really useful, but perhaps aren't so specific. So I would say, what we need to do to create those spaces, which are very much about teacher agency and creating those dialogic spaces with students where they can be active participants, is to think about what can we take out perhaps to make a bit of space. And the work that we've been doing, talking to teachers about reform in the lead up, has been a lot of discussion about, well, we should do this, we should do that, we should do this. And my question is, but you don't want more exams and you don't want more qualifications. We're trying to cut those. So what do we need to take out to create space for these, maybe diversification, different texts Bethan was talking about, or maybe conversations, or, more dialogic teaching. Once obviously students have got to a certain point of fluency with their literacy, which I think, is another point, that it's wonderful to have these conversations. But the reality of a lot of schools at secondary level is some students are arriving not with reading fluency and not being able to access the text in the first place. So there are some sort of barriers at that level as well that I think we need to think about. So thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. And it's interesting that we are talking here about education from primary to secondary to college, university level, and how this all needs to be joined up and thought through. But as you say, there are varied opportunities for doing something more radical. And I'm glad you're bringing up bell hooks and Audrey Lorne's work here. I mean, we've all grappled with the question of the master tools, I think, in our practice. But why you wanted to come in?
Yes. So what's interesting is, I think for me, we need to kind of probably step away from the context itself and think about structures, the system, the education itself. The education system exists to stratify. We know that politically, that's what it does. That's its aim, so that it can have certain people in certain places, not others. And so then how does that happen? How, through all these structures we have, the exam boards and the various ways and the curriculum set by the government, and it's driving a particular ideological, particular point of view of seeing the world and living in the world. So the same, so as Fozia said, what are we going to do? Students will have to engage with it because the system is structured in such a way that it doesn't let you step out of it to have a more enriching experience, to give people with other skills and other ideas to come through, because it's structured in a very heavy, it's about satisfying the class system or whatever you want to call it in any society. That's how it has evolved over time. What's also interesting, Bethan was talking about, is that the exams, before, the civil servants used to have an exam in the olden days, colonial period, is to study the Bible. So when British arrived in India, they figured out that because Hinduism and other religious things are pretty strong, the Bible would be a bad idea. So they introduced literature. So Shakespeare and others were their way. So they find that to be successful there, and they bring it back to England and use that as civil service exam later on. So it's interesting what the ideological things behind these ways of assessment is actually trying to achieve, or make it work. So the other aspect for me in the colonial argument is there is an element of naivety, thinking that we are objective. We seem to think knowledge is objective. We can assess somebody objectively to give some sort of a grade or some sort of achievement. It is laden with our political personal biases, and nothing is objective. I mean, one of the readings, was saying how it lives in the old eugenics idea of science being somehow objective, and then taking that idea and putting it, and then trying to classify, categorize these things. And we still seem to think of this rigor and this quantitative idea of, if we can count the number of people doing X or Y, then we are wonderful, actually, we have achieved some degree of truth. So I think, for me, it's scary. It's scary. We can't do it. It's in the sense of we can't walk into a classroom and do it tomorrow. But we need to have the conversation to challenge some of the ideas of why assessment is there and who benefits from this and who is marginalized from this. And then to see that is how the decolonial aspect, for me, starts to speak more strongly to kind of look at things.
Thank you so much, everyone. I mean, this is a great opening discussion, and I can see a lot of activity in the chat already. And thank you, everyone, for your comments. Please post them as we speak. And we've touched upon a couple of things in terms of what we are assessing, what counts as knowledge, what's the use of assessment, and also those various colonial residues in assessment. And I suppose what Fozia brought was really interesting for me in terms of how, I mean, you have to talk about the university as a colonial, institutionally racist place, and at the same time think about how you don't want to alienate the student, because, as you say, for some of them it's about mobility, it's about kind of first-time access to higher education. But I think it's important to create that space about the institution, about their disciplines, about what they're learning in conversation. And I think you also, Steph, mentioned the kind of that dialogic relationship with the students and with our own teaching and how we approach it. I wanted to maybe move us to the next point of our discussion, which links to someone's comment in the chat around I'm just going to read it out, around the systematic removal of speaking and listening as a meaningful component of assessment at GCSE in the UK. And that's quite interesting, because my next question was to be around one of the most commonly used assessment in our discipline, which is the essay, and the focus on writing as opposed to other forms of displaying knowledge. I mean, we emphasize the kind of the Western-centric way of emphasizing writing and documenting and classifying, as opposed to oral traditions and different ways of, I suppose, assessing knowledge. So, and often the essay is a form that requires objectivity, which is, again, another expectation steeped in coloniality. And I wanted us to maybe reflect on our experiences of using this format or any type of written assessment. And my question is really, maybe if you could share examples of your own practice, but also, do you think it allows for the students' own knowledges, identities, or emotions, or positionalities to be included in any meaningful ways? And I suppose that's even more difficult at secondary, primary level than at higher education. So, Fozia, I can see your hand first, and then Bethany.
Thank you so much. I found it, I mean, the university, I don't think, allows us to have a free rein when it comes to assessment. So we have some parameters in terms of, we have some norms that we're sort of expected to follow, but within that we have leeway. So one thing that we've done with the decolonial approaches modules that we have for level 3 students or third year students is that we've replaced the essay with a critical review of literature, and that can include a review of not just academic literature, but for example, blogs, for example, literatures in other languages, for example, any form of expression, as long as the student can justify why they're including that form of expression. So that's one assessment. The other assessment is a reflective log on their learning journey, where they talk about their engagement with different kinds of sources and how that's helped them to develop kind of a method for what becomes their final year dissertation. And that's been, I think, quite good, because it does give students an opportunity to develop their own thinking around assessment to some extent. Although the assessments are fixed, but what they do within those shapes or structures, there's quite a lot of freedom. In terms of kind of where we go to open up the whole idea of assessment, and I completely agree that, you know, the idea of evaluating knowledge is very hierarchical, and but there is, in my view, an important skill set to be learned from, not necessarily from the essay, but from writing generally, or developing writing skills generally, which is about finding your voice in and amongst a lot of other voices. And I find that the students are doing that, you know, through the critical review, they're doing that through the reflective log. But if there were to be a change that I would like to make, it would not be to remove essays altogether, but rather it would be to put essays into context, to say the essay is developed as a form, and this is its history, and this is what it's meant to do. It's meant to show how you've developed an argument, or you've developed an understanding of a topic, but there are other ways of doing it. And so in that sense, I can see the value to some kind of an essay, because it is a way to say to a student, this is your journey. At the end of it, what do you think? You know, so I have kind of mixed feeling about essays. I mean, I wrote lots of essays in undergraduate, and thank God we don't impose that on our students. But at the same time, I think learning and writing, you know, we have to sort of maybe perhaps find a balance between not imposing a very restricted idea of what assessment should look like through the essay, but also finding ways to develop student skills of expression. So that's kind of something I'd like to share, you know, with colleagues about how, and ask how you all do it as well. You know, thank you.
Great, thank you. I like the sharing of practice. It's wonderful. Bethan, what are your thoughts here?
I was going to pick up on Andrew Green's comment before you did it. You did it very well yourself, because actually there is a hope that oracy is going to come back into the curriculum, particularly in the language GCSE. So there is space now for an oral component to come back into it, and that would do away with essays as such, though it's debatable what they mean by oracy. So they may mean making speeches, which is just as restrictive as writing an essay in lots of ways, but they might not, and it could be truly dialogic. So you could get a dialogue. In the past, when we used to do coursework, they did do dialogues about learning, and that was a very rich avenue. So particularly when they assessed Shakespeare, there was an oral component. So you could assess your response to a Shakespeare play not through an essay, but through talking about it, or a drama presentation, or there were loads of ways around it through speech. And that, I think, is a very good way of doing it. There was also a comment about the Canadian syllabuses, and they say that they don't rely so much on essays and formal stuff and standardized assessment, and that is true too. So in Canada, again, you can assess things in a much greater variety of ways. The trouble is now that AI has come in, and so people are wondering whether or not, you know, even essays are actually written by children themselves, and you know, so there is that query. But when we had 100% coursework in the past, people got students to assess themselves in a huge variety of ways. So I remember there was one teacher who used to get them to, he was doing Ted Hughes, and a load of students did a model of their response to the Ted Hughes poem, which was fascinating. And then they had to talk about why they'd done it as they'd done it. And that was a really different way and a very student-focused way of doing it. Now that kind of thing has gone out the window altogether, and they do these ridiculous essays with all these P's and petals and peasels and all this kind of stuff, and that has kind of bastardized the whole essay form. So for students in schools, the whole nature of essay writing, which can be a good and productive thing, has been wiped out, because now teachers say, if you want to pass the exam, you have to make this point at this stage in this way, and that's how you'll get a grade 8 or grade 9. And it has dissolved even the very purpose of writing an essay.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know I speak to our first year students who come to the university and say, oh, well, how do I write an essay at a university level? How is it different to A level?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And even now, because I've taught university courses as well, you have to say what your strict success criteria are and the criteria for what you're doing, and you lay out the criteria for each of the grade levels, and students still more or less do a PESEL test, and it does restrict it. When we did it without that, you would get a greater range, so you get more really, really good ones and more duff ones. But now they are all concertinaed in the middle, because we've done away with the power of what an essay can do, because we've restricted it so much that it even that's gone for a burn bit. So yeah.
Thank you. I've got Arunima, Steph, and Kaya, and Vi. Arunima, would you like to go first?
Yeah. So I'll start with my point on the essay first, and then come back to the canonical teacher training thing that we are doing at the university as well, the PDGE courses, and the rationale behind that. So with the essay format, when I come to my 4th year decolonization, migration, literature module, I really think that it is important for the students to know what academic writing looks like, to be able to critique the ideologies that underpin it. So it is important, again, as Bethan was saying as well, when she was talking about the canonical, it is important to teach Shakespeare, to be able to teach The Tempest in a postcolonial module and show why, if you know the standard readings of it and the context and everything, then it is possible to then take it into the phase of the decolonization without having to do that over 2 or 3 classes and sacrifice other texts. So that's one thing, that in the academic year 1, and we have had a lot of discussion amongst us teachers at Napier about this, in terms of why is it necessary to teach what is expected of academic writing, including, what is mentioned in the comments, as in the paragraph format and the argument structure, and what goes in the introduction, what looks like creditable source. And those are the very ideas that then we can challenge in year 3 and year 4, and show them the rationale for challenging those same criteria. But if they do not know the criteria, we are not empowering them with the capacity to understand why, the rationale of the critique. So it is no use just saying that you have to critique it because it is, implication, the power structure is implicated in it and buried in it. And therefore you have to notice, if you have not shown them where the power structures or how it is done, if they have not gone the right route of going through library search and looking for peer-reviewed journals, and what does that mean in terms of what is a peer-reviewed journal or article, and then you can come back and show what the process of peer review looks like, and then ask them to critique that at a later stage in the degree. I have found that productive. I would like to know your thoughts on that, all of you. Second is the question about the canon and about relationship with teaching, and I wanted to address that because I found that very relevant about what Bethan was saying, and in the sense that when we are discussing the PDGE course with the person who is going to offer it to school teachers who want to go into secondary education, we were thinking about, and this is from the HRC project which we did with Strathclyde's teacher training program, and they designed a toolkit for it for school teachers in history and English, because that is what they wanted out of the project, out of the collaboration. And it is also based on this, in the idea that there has to be an understanding of how canon is built, and then how decolonization is applied or can be use to interact with it. And that is how we are talking about the rationale of the course that we will be offering as well, in terms of how you identify and understand canon, and how, for example, Shakespeare or any of these, where they sit in the understanding, the making of the knowledge framework, and then go into decolonization and see what you can sort of scavenge from there, that being the critical term, and apply to as critical methodologies to read the positions of power and ideologies there. And that is what the school teachers were interested in doing, including in history and English, those who worked with us on that project, that is. And we worked with the David Livingstone Museum. So there was a lot of, sort of accrued little projects that the museum had already done with school teachers that kind of fed into it. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Arima. I really like what you said about the, teaching the conventions of academic writing that were also set up by kind of Western Euro-centric standards at some point, and then, they have helping them to dismantle them. But Steph, would you like to come in next?
Yeah, I was going to pick up on that point too. It's that idea of Picasso, I suppose, like being a master, draftsman, or whatever the right word is, being able to draw traditionally, to then be able to explode all of those traditions and create quite different forms of art. And I was also thinking about the connection between writing and thinking. So even writing by hand, that embodied cognition of actually writing things out helps you to work out your thought process. When you're writing, you're thinking, what do I think about this? You're drafting, you're editing, you're going back, you're changing it. So I think, writing, it doesn't necessarily have to be an essay, but something that has a form of argument where you can put your ideas across. I think that's very empowering. So, there are other forms which create arguments, but whether it's, formal debate or an essay, or there are some structures which are helpful as a structure, that you can learn the structure, and then they're kind of a vessel for you to think on the spot about what you actually think when you're writing. So sometimes there's a bit of cognitive offloading to a form that already exists. So if you kind of know how to write an argument or construct an argument, then when you know how to do that, you can bring your ideas to bear and find your voice, as someone else was saying earlier. So I think that connection between thinking, writing, argument, being important to put your point forward, some of those structures can be helpful. I think, again, it's about that element of having space within the classroom or the school year we talked about, topics and texts earlier, and having space to, perhaps explore some different texts, but also to explore different types of writing and different types of speaking and conversations in the classroom as well. So I think when Bethan spoke earlier about the importance of formative assessment, often what happens is this sort of warping happens by the terminal assessment, whereby the assessment can become the curriculum. And even when examiners' reports from AQA specifically call out things like PEE, and specifically say in the A-level examiners, I spend time with these people, they say all we want them to do is read the book and answer the question. These sort of force, PE paragraphs or whatever they might be, or having to learn loads of quotations, it's okay to have textual reference rather than quotation. So I think there's a lot of warping that comes from the accountability structures and the kind of fears that schools have. They want to do the best by their students. They want to get them their grades. They want to do everything they can to make sure their students succeed, because that's why they're there. But I think, unfortunately, it takes a sort of very strong approach and a lot of confidence and perhaps a lot of experience in the classroom to be able to say, okay, there's the exam. I know what it is. We're going to do that in you're in year 7. We're going to do that in 5 years. Let's not worry about that just yet. Let's have some really interesting text, conversations, opinions, ideas, lots of different talking, lots of different writing, because actually, ironically, that will probably work out better for you than doing lots of like GCSE summative questions time and time again, from year 7. And, and not to criticize any school that's got any structure that's working well for their students and getting, great outcomes for them, because that's what it's all about. But I think there is a sort of a bit of a fear factor because of the accountability and the need to get those results for their students, that sometimes can squeeze out the space for other formative assessment, dialogic teaching, less formulaic, structures. And I think, again, it's unfortunate that even if the examiner's reports say you don't have to do that, somehow this warping creeps in. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Steph. I think it kind of links back to what I was saying earlier about, I suppose, the educational system producing certain exclusions and boundaries and uneven power relations. I think, as you said, there is the attempt to get the students to have good grades, but at the same time, some schools are performing better than others, and that already creates a kind of an uneven system in itself. So yeah, that's really interesting what you raised there. Kaya, would you like to come in now?
Yeah, actually has been really echoed in the comments by Catherine, actually, which I think the first thing is coming back to that power dynamic that Dee mentioned earlier and somebody else mentioned about if there is the absence of the context of what's it in, then the student can't critically think to critique it. So if there is no awareness or anything being taught about where it's rooted in, so if we think about terms like the ideologies of white supremacy and other systems of oppression, and that being paramount to be taught early on before the age of 9, where your kind of beliefs, those unconscious beliefs, which can emerge from 3 months old, if they are not taught from an early age, how can we therefore encourage students to think, to critique it earlier on in their educational trajectory? But I think, as Catherine has rightly said in the comments, and she's kind of put it beautifully here around the kind of pre-formed kind of structures that is required in order to access an assessment. So if you're coming into an assessment, you're most probably going to be more thinking about, okay, I need to remember these quotes. I need to make sure that they're framed properly. And it's not really about embedding in the context. So therefore, we have to think about, is it really about the student voice, or is it more around kind of like the capitalist kind of view on it, of trying to produce an outcome? So if we think about who gets the higher grades, it is that inference. It is being able to use quotations and being able to embed it rightly so. But does that mean it's critical thinking, or is it really about what is the expectation that is set for in order to access the curriculum? I think tools can be used as a point of, especially around accessibility to the education system, where those who don't find essays a format that is accessible to them as a guideline. But if we therefore impose it as, in order for you to get this grade, you must be able to use this, and that, then that is therefore the focus area. So I think we cannot be, I think, as somebody else said before, naive to the imposition of these systems within the access of assessment, and therefore an essay. So if we want people to think freely about it, it has to be critical thinking within the centre of it, because otherwise it does inevitably eradicate voice, because it's no longer about the student voice. It's more around, okay, there is this one pupil, how have they therefore answered this question that we are expecting them to answer in this way? So really just echoing really collectively everyone's thoughts that it really is the power dynamics at play here. So it can be a format that can be used, but I think we need to be thinking about the critical thinking and the decolonial perspective at the heart of that.
Thank you, Kaya. Bye.
Yes, Kaya, well, that's a lot of things you're saying is very much what I'm also going to launch from, is that I think when assessments are, in a sense, a competitive thing, as we can see, different schools will make sure they get through and they get the high grade. So I'm going back to the original question we started off with: what are we assessing? What exactly are we assessing? And what is the point of it? It is the point of actually keeping some power, right? It's about power. At the end of the day, why am I looking at some pieces of work and say 70 and the other is 50? And in what sense are we And why are we doing this? Why are we doing this to assess somebody as having knowledge? What knowledge are we looking for? Are we looking for their ability to memorize something and reproduce something? So is it a regurgitation of the existing ideological thinking and the rest of the things that come with the learning? We learn. I mean, learning is a place where we learn about our identities, the relationship to our society, community, as well as the ideologies. I mean, otherwise, when we vote the way we vote because we have all of those things come through the education system, right? So I think for me, the gist of it is, what are we assessing? I mean, we don't know. If you ask anybody, we don't know what we are assessing. What exactly do we want out of the student or all of those students? By the end of it, regurgitate. Sometimes it's interesting when you feel, oh, I have given them this feedback and they haven't included it. Do you get offended and mark them down? Or so there's an element of power in a very raw sense. So one of the activities I do, and a couple of quick examples, I used to teach I used to teach MA English Language Teaching. I'd say I used to because the course got closed because of the international student issues. But in that, all the students would come in saying, I want to be able to teach British English. So these are students who are multilingual speakers of English. And the first thing I asked them is, why are you feeling ashamed of your accent, first language, your culture? What's wrong with it? And by the end of the course, they are saying, you have empowered me. Yes, I do need British English because it's nothing to do with British thing that I'm teaching in, I don't know, Sri Lanka or China or whatever. I need to make that. I used to tell them, if you kind of go down the road, you are out of a job. Why would your students want to listen to you? Because if you're harping on about British English, you are not going to be the one who is there. You're saying, don't look at me and don't follow my example. Listen to these audio recordings of a British speaker who is a monolingual speaker English, is then asked to be replicated by the multilingual speaker who already has resources from their first language. So I think even in the assessment, we are not pulling from students' existing resources. We seem to give them a new outline and ask them to start again as if they don't have any background. They come as a clean slate into education, higher education, or any system. The second aspect, in my World English module, I kind of go down the route of saying, you pick an article, peer-reviewed article, summarize it, but then I want you to pick an idea and I want you to take a stance on it and argue it. So it can be identity and language or models that we have talked about which work or don't work, whatever. And I say to you can come back and say to me, British English is the best. I will listen to you as long as you have got an argument, whatever that. But usually they actually go off and have a robust discussion. But my frustration there is we're still living in the same idea of what are we assessing. So when the papers come in, I'm kind of torn, thinking, oh, that's a brilliant argument. And then this learning outcome things that we can set ourselves to beat us with, and the moderation and everything, and then we say, oh, it doesn't meet the learning outcome, so I can't give a first. But it's a beautifully argued piece where I can see what their argument is. So I think maybe I am in the world of thinking, do we even need assessments? But that's where I am.
Thank you, everyone. I mean, this has been a really fruitful discussion, and there's a lot of comments in the chat as well. And I'll probably just summarize and coming back to what Kaya was saying. It's about kind of critical thinking and allowing that space. And I'll just briefly share like what I tell my students when they write essays, and this is in modules such as Postcolonial, Black British writing, or queer writing, where I invite them to share their personal perspectives, their experiences, and they always say, but am I allowed to use I in the essay? Am I allowed to use my voice? And I said, yes, of course, I'm interested in what you have to say. And I absolutely want you to bring that in. I mean, your knowledge, your experiences count. And then we go from there and kind of start criticizing the essay as a form, as a kind of particular form of academic writing, what Arunima was saying earlier. But what's also interesting, I think what you said earlier, I think a lot of you talked about, I mean, our own, well, us being complicit in often perpetuating inequalities and power structures. And obviously, yes, we are assessing, we are, students are coming out with certain outcomes, but obviously we have to consider the awarding gap in UK higher education. And I wanted to ask you specifically around some interventions, more specifically anonymized assessment that was trialed and introduced at many universities. I don't know what's the case like at your institution, as a way of helping to reduce the awarding gap. Obviously, some research out of it has actually said that it has hasn't quite worked, anonymizing the assessment, that is actually still producing biases and inequalities. I remember when I was an external examiner at another university, obviously you can, when you check student work, you can see the student names, and then you can compare the feedback with, I don't know, an English sounding name and a more kind of foreign sounding name, and you can actually clearly see, and I remember raising this as, obviously it's been anonymously marked, but after it has been de-anonymized, you can still see those biases and inequalities in place. So I just wanted to ask you whether what your experience is with kind of anonymized assessment. Steph and Bethan.
Sorry, that was from an old point. So I was just, it's a different question, but I was going to ask whether perhaps with reform and the curriculum assessment review coming out, whether GCSE English language could optimistically provide a space for some of the things that you're talking about there, in terms of understanding and valuing different Englishes, different languages, and having a sort of, the tools to value all the different range that we have, because there seems to be some indication that there's going to be change there, and they want to reflect the subject discipline. We're not sure yet in what way. I just wondered if anyone, I know you're mostly operating in higher education, and Bethan and I, well, Bethan's both, but I'm mostly in secondary education, so I'm always coming from that perspective. But I wonder whether you thought we talk about text and diversifying, but I wondered if you thought there's an opportunity there in GCSE language, and if so, what would you do from your HE perspective? What would you like to see at GCSE English language?
At the moment, I think they do have varieties of English as an option, or they used to have. Some of my students who have come through having done GCSE's English language, there are spaces they seem to have done or engaged with varieties of English. I think the focus still seems to be that there is a standard model, that's British English or American English, and then the other Englishes are against that. So it's kind of saying how that is different, rather than giving them the legitimacy as a multilingual speaker of English. So yes, this is what I mean. So it still has a benchmark, which seems to be British English, and against that, these are presented and discussed, rather than think about what does this language mean to these communities who use it, and language of communication kind of thing. So I mean, so that seems to be the thing. So I think it's a kind of in the World Englishes area is moved on to talk about translanguaging, which is kind of multilinguals do not stick to one language. They always move in and out of languages, and just think about how also we seem to always focus on the written and spoken, the orality and the orality aspects and other things, rather than just to multimodality. we seem to ignore the multiple words. And in the translanguaging argument, they say when I throw in a list of my first language Tamil, I throw in Tamil words, I could still use my gestural and other modalities to explain what it means, and you will understand the word in context and so on. So there is a long discussion to be had to move away from there is one variety that is the native speaker variety is superior to the others, to moving to say actually these are as legitimate varieties for speakers of other languages. Yeah, so it's happening. Right, Bethan?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the potential with I'm going to come to your point about blind marking in a minute, but the potential for that English language section, which focuses on speech and talking, could be potentially very useful. And they are looking at, studying idiolects and that kind of thing, which would really encourage students to look at the diversity of the way in which we interact. So that there are promising grounds for that. The problem is that there's an awful lot of stuff on standard English too, and speech making, and you think, well, it could be good, and also there's room for dialogic teaching as well, and thinking and pupils being able to think through problems orally as opposed to having to script them, and all those things are very potential. And the Let's Think English stuff, which is big in schools, which concentrates on students actually having to think through things through talk and listening, is really, really important. I'm not sure. I hope that it will happen in the English language thing, and we must encourage boards and all those kind of things to take that up and push it. But I don't know whether or not it will ultimately, but it would be great if it did. I mean, it's much better than what we had before. The marking things blind, we have a combination. So when I mark things, my PGC students have two main assignments. One is marked blind and one is marked that you actually see this, you know who the student is who's written it. And I don't think it actually makes that much difference. I mean, I know that it's done in order to make, you don't have prejudice against a particular student and you don't know that they've done it, and so you mark it blind. But I'm not sure that it does that. Also, there are gender issues as well. We talk a lot about decolonisation, and I think that that's absolutely vital, but there's a huge gender thing as well. So that people, we did an REF looking at contributions to the REF, and they were all marked blind, and one was, and we looked at all of them, and one was clearly written by a man. He referenced almost not at all, but he was very confident in the way he did it, and it was all very bombastic and marvelous, and he was given a 4. And then this other one was very studious, loads of references, meticulously argued, and and it was given a 2. And you think, this is outrageous. This is entirely sexualized, gender specific stuff. Because and they said, no, we're not talking about gender. They were saying, no, we're not saying that this is written by a man. And I said, yes, but it is written by a man, isn't it? This is written by a man. And he said, in the end he had to say yes, and it was so clear. So actually, there are all sorts of biases that are there, even if they are not blind. There are huge things that we have to consider. I don't know how they write these things that are so confident. I don't understand how they do it. I keep on saying, well, maybe I'll try, maybe I'll ape a man and write, and I can't do it at all. It's ridiculous. I don't know how they've managed to be so confident. I always sound very hesitant, and umming and ahhing.
They have been socialized into privilege. So
I know, socialized from birth, and it's so unfair. Anyway.
Yeah. Thank you, Beth and Kaya. Did you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I guess just from the definition of decolonising, I think going to your point, Bethan, that decolonising doesn't mean the absence of gender. I see it for a very kind of intersectional lens. So when we say about decolonizing, it's making sure that all intersections are included and seeing how actually they very much are at play. So the example that you gave was very much a byproduct of not only the patriarchy working in action, but also white supremacy working in action. So when we think about how it shows up, it does intersect and overlap. And I think it's really important to stress that when we decolonize, it means the liberation of everybody when it comes to this practice. And I guess I think kind of my answer is quite short to this. You can't really anonymize a system that's working as it's designed to. I think it really is more of a plaster over a bigger wound that is at play. And I think the bigger question is behind that is, if you are to anonymize it, those who are taking this so-called anonymize, are they trained before doing the anonymized process? And if there is no training in place, therefore it's just a byproduct of the same system, which is why most probably you won't see change, is because there's no training in place to make sure that you're able to check in on your bias and also think critically behind it. So I think it's about critical thinking in application to the anonymized thing that you may be able to see change. So I think it's really important that we see that holistically here too.
I agree 100%. Like someone else in the chat with you, Kaya. Arunima, would you like to come in on this one, and then we can invite?
So yes, I completely agree with what Kaya said and about gender and decolonization as well, because in whatever sector, in allied sectors which overlap with education as well, you see the same thing. So I was actually going to engage with Andrew Green's comment where he's talking about the willingness and unwillingness of, for good or better reasons, to embrace what are perceived or perhaps more risky options when faced with realities of the behemoth of the assessment system. I completely, and this is something that I had written down in my notes as well, and kind of speaks back to what Fawzia was saying about negotiations with the university and trying to not demoralize the student or not look at their socioeconomic context as well. Because, for anti-colonial and counter-hegemonic pedagogy and assessment, it is very difficult to sell it to someone who has not directly been implicated in the erasures caused by that system. And more often than not, the university, and we all have agreed that it's a place of privilege, it's a place of, where only certain kinds of people with particular kinds of bank balances can access in some cases, though education is to an extent free in Scotland. So that's a bit different argument we can have. But in general, of course, the privilege of the place is guaranteed. So it's very difficult to then, that was one of the things that I also came to. And in some cases, apart from assessments as well, particularly texts, there have been issues, there have been conversations about how there is a drop in attendance in the weeks where texts which are difficult in terms of race and gender particularly, and intersections of that, are not as well attended as other, and not picked up for essays and assessments as well. And how to make that a more, how to argue for that, given that we have only 10 weeks of teaching and it's a limited contact time in which we have to do loads. So how to make it a practical, and this is a question, it's becoming a question and for all of you, as to how to approach this in a more, in a way where we can do this outside of the class, as in embed this in the module and the program structure so that we don't have to do so much work in the classroom itself while teaching. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Runa. I mean, yeah, really interesting points there to reflect on. Just mindful of the time.
Quickly. So with anonymous marking, the problem is always our language leaks, right? So whether we like it or not, our language leaks the way we write. We don't all write the same. And Margaret Thatcher is a good example that she actually changed the way she actually spoke after she became Prime Minister to be very masculine in her language use. So language is very, it's interesting in the way we kind of write is very much captures who and what the thinking is. So if you're not aware, so people are marking in this standardized English expectations, and then of course we can anonymize it and the language will be different, and you're not giving any space for that different ways of thinking about it. With the question that was asked about what do we do, students don't engage with the text. It's interesting because my initial response would be to, if you can match a similar text with and ask them to compare it. I'm against assessment, by the way, but if you kind of go down the assessment route and say, or have a weekly output where they are able to compare these difficult texts with something else that are very similar, like, Jane Eyre and White Cigars of Sea, is kind of comes together in ways that you can talk about the thing that you don't want to talk about, right? Which is Jane Eyre is presented as a feminist novel, and you think at the expense of a Black woman, right? So you have those discussions to be had, which is possible in ways to kind of, but on the other hand, I can understand why they are not engaging, because from school level, we haven't introduced a counter argument or different ways of thinking about it. That when they come to university, they are thinking, I need my grades. It's a competitive assessment environment. I need my grades. I go with what I know. So it's not, because I think sometimes we think the students have bought into the ideology, but I think they are already being socialized into the ideology that they struggle to get out. But if we can give them enough space to get out of it and encourage them to get out of it, I'm sure they will want, I'm hoping. I mean, my students get really passionate about it and go for it because they suddenly feel, oh, I have the freedom to critique this idea or have this different view. But they're third year, so.
Thank you, Vi. And Steph, briefly, would you like to come in? You had your hand raised.
It might be a slight tangent, but I was still sort of thinking about those ideas around writing as empowerment and writing in the real world, and the idea about being in negotiation with institutions. And then I was thinking, well, we're sort of in negotiation with the algorithm now. And certain types of writing or opinions get promoted over others, and they may be, and I saw an experiment, and don't quote me on it because I only saw it online, where someone had just changed their gender on a social media platform and then done an experiment to see whether their content got promoted in a certain way. And so I wonder if we're thinking about promoting, writing as finding your voice and communicating in the real world in two senses. How do we sort of do battle with AI and the algorithm that way in terms of promoting our voices in the world, or student voices, the students who we're talking about? And also, how do we cope with the sort of role of AI in student writing, where they're potentially cognitively offloading or outsourcing their voice to AI in the creation of their own writing? Because it seems like there's almost two battles. There's one in the creative process, and then there's also almost one in the kind of receptive or real world, how to have your voice heard outside the educational institution when you get out there. But that was just something that it came to mind as something that's very much present in how we're communicating in our writing at the moment.
Absolutely. I think we need probably a whole session on decolonization and AI. Maybe that's for another one for us to think about. I'm mindful of the time, and I'd like to give space for some Q&A, but I'd like to ask you like a final question, and maybe if you can answer in one, well, as briefly as possible. Obviously, we talked about decolonial strategies in assessment and devising assessments within the colonial structures of higher education or secondary education. And I wanted just to ask you what has worked or what hasn't worked for you, if you could share any examples from your own practice or from your anti-racist education. Steph, you've got your hand first. Brilliant. Or is it an old one? A legacy?
It was an old one. Sorry, I didn't realise in Zoom you have to put your hand down as well.
Kaya.
Yeah, I'll keep this as brief as possible. So the work that we're doing in alignment with Brighton University is what we call our remediation audit, which rather than just a tick box exercise, it is a holistic, essentially bird's eye view into the school structure. And I think for us, we've picked the lens of an anti-racist lens, so the school itself can commit to being a truly anti-racist school. And through this 3-year plan that we've got with the school that goes through the internal processes, policies, procedures, that also is engaging all educational stakeholders in the mission of it. So that is youth voice at the forefront, but also making sure that parents, carers, and supporters get opportunities, governors, educational staff as a whole are involved in the whole process. So it isn't just dedicated to those who are passionate about it to drive the work. It's making sure that everyone's involved with that. And the whole idea of it is that the school becomes a ecosystem that is very much aware of the need to keep the work going, but hopefully by the end of the 3-year plan, the school becomes interdependent. So it doesn't mean that it's very much a thank you very much and on your way, but more of a matter of we will be a forever supporting system and body for them, but to encourage them to become that ecosystem of adapting to change as it informs from the ever-growing climate that is around them to inform the anti-racist practice. So that's what we do at Youth the Gap.
Thank you, Kyle. We're really excited to be working with you, and particularly in a primary school setting. And yeah, just watching kind of how this holistic approach we can hopefully invite you to replicate at our university. Watch this space. Arunima.
I totally agree with Kaya, and I wish I could push for such resources, where organizational change could be brought in with like changes on the ground in terms of classroom teaching and pedagogy. I mean, all my museums have the museums I'm working with have the resources to initiate that and action that, and I can see the changes that are happening. So I totally on board with that. I just wanted to come back to the point about, reproducing assessments as form of reproducing knowledge. And part of what I have tried to think about in my assessment strategies and evidence my research in that in terms of like what I'm doing on the side is to kind of focus on the application bit of it and to ask students to evidence the application and base their argument on those evidences. And in that sense, and therefore portfolio works really well for me in that sense, as a sort of assessment format where there is and I can discuss new formats. I have kept like option E open for any format that someone wants to suggest as what is not on the list already as portfolio items. So that's one thing. Also, going back to my previous point and kind of tying it up back is one of the things I've learned from the work in the cultural heritage sector, which I've tried to apply to classrooms and it has helped me this year, is to have a conversation around discomfort and around how discomfort is essential to literature in some ways. Like if you're reading a novel and you're rooting for a character, they're definitely going through conflict, right? You're not happy about it. So that's also pleasure, right? That's also one of the reasons you're reading the book. So in that graph kind of gives you a sort of a gratification. So I've tried to place it in that region where I have tried to say that, that this discomfort that you're experiencing is something that's part of the narrative of learning, and try and view it in that way as you being part of that process rather than standing out of it and objectively viewing it as something that you need to analyze. So that's been one of the conversations that I could bring in from my work in the heritage sector to the classroom, and I think it worked better. I can tell you from once the academic year is over as to how that goes for me. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Arunima. I'll share one from my own module, and this is a third-year undergraduate module called Postcolonial Literature. So every week, for 10 weeks, they engage with postcolonial writing from across multiple contexts, and they can, for one of their assessments, they can do a so-called writing back textual intervention in response to one of the themes or texts studied on the module, or current legacies of colonialism. So it's quite an open format where they can do a creative response or they can write like a short kind of reflective essay. But I tell them it's what the essay is really valuing your personal experiences. And it's really in the same way, I suppose people will be familiar with the Colonial Countryside project that Professor Corinne Fowler did with a group of school children in terms of responding to the National Trust properties and then writing creative work in response to some of the paintings and objects there. So I think the students find this really interesting, where they can actually engage with the British colonial history that are often not taught at primary or secondary level in any depth or form. But I'm mindful that we only have 10 minutes left, and I absolutely love the chat. I wonder if we can find maybe a way to share this with all the panelists and maybe the participants, if that's okay. I'm sure Rebecca can sort this out for us. But I know there was one question from Andrew, and I'm just trying to find it because there are so many. Oh, right. Okay. So I'll read this question first because I think, and apologies if I missed any questions, but I think this one was the first. So this is from Andrew Green, and I hope it's okay for me, Andrew, to read it out. What does the panel think about the curricular framing in the UK, at least, of the subject not as literature, but as English literature? Beth, have you got your Beth and Fozia and Steph?
I mean, I had my hand up for the previous question, but I am happy to talk about that. I mean, I think it's quite interesting that whether or not it's English literature or just literature in general. And my bias would be to say, look at literature rather than English literature, because, you know, that's a colonizing name in itself. Although I have to say that I think that it, for me, and this is a complete bias and peculiar to me, I don't think you should read things in translation. So from that point of view, things written in English is not a bad idea, but the notion of English literature has all those canonical phrases. So I think that it would be better if it was just literature. But nevertheless, I think that I mean, I'm reading a book in translation at the moment. I'm reading the Nobel laureates, and it's very good, but it's not his writing; it's his translator's writing. It's a peculiar bias I have, but there you go.
Thank you, Beth. And Fozia, would you like to come in?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I agree. Beth, there are problematics around reading in translation, and I share your concerns. I see the question as having more than one dimension. On the one hand, English literature is very colonial and it recalls the British Empire, it recalls all kinds of power dynamics. I also think that, there's another question that arises from that question, which is our idea of disciplines themselves and compartmentalizing knowledge. And one of the things I do say to first year students is that I get first year students doing in Middle Eastern studies, doing Islamic history with me, and I say to them, although we have a particular curriculum and we're covering certain topics, these are not your horizons. These are the limits that we impose because you have to do a certain amount of learning and produce pieces of work within this particular framing. But in terms of your actual learning, whatever you bring in from other disciplines, particularly in classroom discussion, is really enriching and really valuable. And so we kind of break down those barriers, even verbally, and in terms of the students' own kind of reflexive journey, even though they're well aware, as I am, that they have to write within a particular structure and read a particular kind of body of literature, of scholarly literature, as part of that journey, even if it's critically and alongside other kinds of sources. So I think the question actually hints at a bigger question, which is around how we can compartmentalize knowledge and how the colonial underpinnings of that are so widely understood, but we still haven't done anything about it. We still teach in this very, very rigid way, again picking up on some of the comments in the chat, this soulless way where we well, it can be soulless, I'm not saying it always is, but the framing is certainly an imposition on us as teachers, and then we have to impart that to our students. But I think standing back and saying it's an imposition, we work with it, we work against it, we work kind of around it, and contextualizing that the kind of the formation of colonial knowledge, I think really helps students, because they want to understand how we've got to where we're at, even if they know they have to work within a system. And I think that is what they find empowering about those conversations.
Thank you, Fozia. Steph?
Yeah, I think it's a bit about being able to kind of interrogate and critique the canon as well, isn't it? It's all about that. So in response to the previous one about practice, it's more diversification than perhaps I can't even speak anymore at the end of Friday, decolonizing the curriculum. But we worked closely with Penguin Lit in Colour, and we worked with them on some canon in colour sessions, which I'll just share the link for, which again looked at, okay, we have to work with the texts that are here on the curriculum, but these are some different lenses and approaches that you can take. And I think, so as we know from Michael Gove, we have the 2015 stipulation about text from the British Isles, but you know, it's a much bigger conversation than that. And I think what's interesting is putting texts in conversation with each other, and hopefully that's something we can, you know, develop further.
Sorry about the siren earlier on. Thank you, Steph.
Yes, I do this particular thing in my module World Englishes, and so within English within the UK, it's interesting to think about whether Welsh literature, you can say literature, should we be including Welsh and Scottish literature kind of thing, but English literature from post-colonial point of view, literature kind of seems to, and then only have English literature written in English, seems to assume the other languages don't have literature behind them. So in some ways, English literature is very specific in a sense, and I think it comes from the nation-state argument from the 19th century when they decided that literature was a way to solidify the idea of sovereign nation. So German literature was written by a German author in German. But now, where would you put Salman Rushdie and Midnight Children? Is it English literature, or is it literature, world English literature? What is it? So I think
you famously said Commonwealth literature doesn't exist in the essay.
Exactly. So it's interesting. So then you have Ngugi, of course, you have the translations, as we have talked about, and also his actual writing in English as well. So, and actually, do we say it's literature in English or English literature? What does it mean? So this is where I think it is a discussion in its own right. I think we have had, and I raise it in my classroom because originally the whole idea was about a national identity. But since English has become a global language and people are writing in English, then are we saying English literature is all white male pale kind of thing, or are we saying a little bit bigger than that, which is then Rushdie and others come in, or are we not? So, so for me, English literature is pretty much talks about whatever is written by British English, Black British. This is why they have started to kind of have these Black British writers and Asian English literature kind of thing categories. So it's another topic to be had.
Yeah. I'll just briefly, wonderful tools. Thanks, Steph, for sharing on all the great resources in the chat, and I absolutely love the color campaign. I always flag it out to my students, and it's amazing work. Whether we call it literature or English literature, I mean, funnily, my job title is lecturer in literature rather than English literature. For some reason, Brighton decided that this is the wrong title, but we still teach degrees called English literature. And I think for me, the question is about broader question around decolonization, and it's about what you include or exclude under that title. And particularly us at Brighton, I mean, I teach on single honors literature. We have done some significant work over the years, although I remember 10 years ago having debates, really difficult debates around, why is post-colonial literature an optional module at level 6? And we have Victorian, early modern, Shakespeare. These are all core modules. So this has all changed now, and we've kind of completely transformed the degree. So even thinking about periods or text, it's all gone. So we've only just started a new iteration of the degree this year, and post-colonial literature module is becoming a second-year core module on our single honors literature degree, and it also includes kind of half of it is post-colonial literature, and the other one is Black British writing, because that's what I do. So yeah, we'll see how we get on.
And where would they fit in? Would Berlin Everestone fit in post-colonial or English literature?
Exactly. Well, it's a debate we have with students. Right. I'm mindful that we are right on time. We have 1 minute left in this on this panel, and I just want to thank everyone for such amazing contributions. Really lovely comments from our attendees, and we hope we can share this and carry on the conversation. This will be available on Decolonising the Discipline website as a recorded talk, so a lot to share, a lot to ponder on a Friday evening. And thank you again, everyone, for joining this panel and for your contributions. And have a lovely weekend and a lovely evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.